We've never spoken about Hitler on the show, and I think it would be interesting to hear, given the current environment, maybe in the background, if there is a simple story, because obviously it's a complicated thing, but how it was that Hitler came to power in Germany.
Yeah, I'll be glad to give you a thumbnail overview of it. But let me start by telling you I think it is immediately applicable to the United States. And the way I tell you the story, I think you'll see how that works. If not, I'll make it explicit.
We can do both.
Yes. The German, think of it this way. In the 19th century, the dominant player in the global economy was Britain. It is the century of the British Empire, of whom it was said, the sun never sets on the British Empire, because wherever the sun is going down, there's Britain, and wherever it's coming up, there's another part of Britain, right? India was the great gem, but British Empire included parts of Latin America, large parts of Africa, large parts of Asia, and so forth. Not to speak of Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and all the rest of it. But there were two up-and-coming challengers to the British Empire across the 19th century. One was the United States, the ex-colony of Britain, and the other one was Germany. These two countries were capitalists, understood that Britain was the one to beat if you're going to make it. I don't think either of them aspired to replace the British Empire, but the thought crossed their mind, and it was a delicious thought. You have the United States, the Monroe Doctrine. We're going to take over Latin America is ours. Whoa, wow. Colonial dreams. Like taking Greenland, say, or Panama, or making Canada the 51st state, that sort of thing. And Germany had a notion of it really being a challenger to Britain. The German word Reich, das Reich in German, is empire in English, roughly. Hitler was going to create the Third Reich. That's what he called his project. They had had two earlier Reichs, the empire. The Germans had, for example, large chunks of Africa that they had colonized in the south, in the east, in the west. They had a piece of China. They had colonies in Asia and so forth. So they were trying to develop. In Germany, they were mostly successful, as they were in the United States. They not only grew dramatically, but Germany wasn't really a country until the second half of the 19th century. Before that, it was broken up into little principalities. So the United States had a bit of an edge because it was one country from Atlantic to Pacific, pretty much by the middle of the 19th century. The big thing that hampered the United States was the Civil War. The big thing that hampered the Germans was the unification, which is lots of little wars with France, with Denmark, and the different pulling together under a charismatic leader, Bismarck by name in Germany. But with the end of the Civil War, the 1860s, and by around roughly that time, a little later in Europe, you had these two powers had come together and were independent, had solved their divisions, north-south with the United States, the defeat of the South, and in the case of Germany, the defeat of those who opposed German unification, chief of which were the French. And they were defeated. In 1870, they were defeated. And I believe you and I have discussed it. The defeat by the Germans of the French opened a moment for the left to have an opportunity. That's the Paris Commune of 1871. Okay. In Germany, the experience here was spectacular. Instead of feeling to be way below the British were rich first. The British had the biggest empire. The British were the center of power. The world used the pound sterling as its currency, all of that. Germany always had an inferiority complex. So they went to work to develop quickly. So from 1860 to the end of the century, 1900, German economic development is spectacular, outgrowing the British Empire, despite the empire being still intact. But they were really, as the United States had its boost of development after 1860, building the railroads and everything else in the West. A whole middle class develops in Germany around the success of their capitalism. A working class, for sure, but a real bourgeoisie in the way that, remember, Germany is feudal much longer than Britain or France is. Feudalism stays strong in Eastern Europe relative to Western as it dies. Long story short, and here's the point. By 1914, Germany is a real successful powerhouse, an exploding economic success, people, middle-class people living extraordinarily prosperous lives. If you ever want to understand it, the novels of Thomas Mann, M-A-N-N, Buddenbrooks, and others capture that better than any sociology can. And the working class, which was the first working class to develop a real socialist movement on a mass scale, not so surprising, Marx was German, so they picked up on him. Very successful, powerful enough that Bismarck made deals with the social, had to. So you had an organized, confident working class who attributed their success not so much to the success of capitalism, but to the success of the Socialist Party in getting a piece of that activity for the working class. Very confident, very proud, and quite rich, saving money. For the Germans, very frugal. Very frugal. So they remembered the hard times before it was clearer for them. And so they think the world is their oyster. They have an empire. It's productive for them. It brings them wealth, and then they have an absolutely crushing experience. All of this is under an emperor. In German, the word is Kaiser, like Tsar or something like that. Kaiser Wilhelm was the one in power at the time. And he leads them into World War I. They're going to win that battle like they've been winning everything else. They lose. World War I, horrific, the most devastating, destroying factories, railroads, everything, killing immense numbers of people in trench warfare, terribly destructive. But most important and cataclysmic for them, they lose. And now, very quickly, a 1, 2, 3 punch. After the war, the Versailles Treaty, which ends World War I, imposes reparations on Germany. The winners are going to make the loser pay for the war. And so Germany is required to devote a huge portion of its resources not to build up Germany after the terrible war, but to pay back the French and the British. And the French and the British insist on being paid. Why? Because to fight World War I, They had borrowed from the United States. That's why the United States becomes the world power, right there. It funded the World War that crushed its enemies or its potential competitors, and consequently the United States becomes the power because no war was fought here, no World War One.
No destruction.
No destruction, relatively smaller number of people involved. World War II wasn't fought here either, except for Pearl Harbor. So you have it again. But before we get to that, here now comes the thing. So the Germans are, after World War I, utterly impoverished. If you want to get an idea of a society destroyed by this experience, then the thing you want to do is look at the painting, look at the literature, look at well, two names I'll give. George Gross, if you're at all familiar with the paintings of George Gross, that's painting Germany in the 1920s after the loss of World War I. The country's flooded with wounded soldiers.
Is this degenerate art?
Yeah. And the greatest theater producer probably in the whole century, Bertolt Brecht, writing in Berlin in the aftermath of this horrible, horrible war. Okay, they can't recover because they're funding the British and the French, who are using the money to repay the Americans. It's destroying what's left of Germany. The shock of the war, then the shock of losing the war, now the shock of being unable to recover. Where does it lead? It culminates the war is over in 1918. In 1923, 5 years later, Germany experiences the worst inflation in modern human history. In a matter of 8 months, the currency goes from 4 or 5 Deutschmark, that's the name of their currency, to $1, to 5 billion Deutschmark.
That's crazy.
Yeah. My parents lived through that. My mother told me stories in which her parents, she lived in Berlin, her father would run home from his job at noon, grab a sandwich prepared by my grandmother, my mother's mother, because he would give her a little bag full of banknotes of money and then run back to his job. She would run to the market to spend the money because if she waited till the evening, the money wouldn't be worth anything anymore.
Yeah. And we think we've got it bad now. And it's bad now.
Well, now here comes the punchline. The Germans were frugal. For the previous 50 years of their spectacular growth and prosperity, they had saved up money. With the money saved by 2 generations over 50 years, they could now purchase a quarter pound of butter. They were wiped out. They couldn't handle it. 5 years later, in 1929, the stock market crashed and we entered the Great Depression. That means you hammered the German working class with a war, a loss of the war, the worst inflation ever, and the worst depression in capitalism's history, all in a 12 or 13-year period. It was too much, and they went crazy. And the proof of it is they turned to a non-German, non-blue-eyed blonde, non-tall person from Austria and said, "You will save us." Adolf Hitler. When does he take power? January of 1933. Right after he collects the catastrophe. In the last 2 elections of 1932, before he takes office, the country split right down the middle. Half went to the old German middle-of-the-road political parties, and the other half split between the Socialist Party and the Communist Party. And the business community held a meeting, of which there are records, which I used in my writing. What are we going to do? Both sides denounced capitalism on the grounds it had brought war. It had been responsible for the reparation. That's why Hitler had to call his fascist party socialist. It's the National Socialist Party. He had to tap into anti-capitalism, otherwise he wouldn't have got to first base. Nazi, N-A-Z-I, that's the first four letters of the German word National, which simply means national. It's the National Socialist Party. So it's Nazi Party against the socialists and communists. And those were fights in the streets. They were fights at the ballot box. The business community realized the country's dissolving into two wings. We have to make a choice. And they went with Hitler. And they turned to Hindenburg, the president of Germany at the time, and told him, you have to invite Hitler to form a government. That's what they did. That's how it happened. Why is it similar? Now, here's the parallel. For the last 30 to 40 years in this country, there's been an income and wealth redistribution. Anybody who studies that, left-winger, right-winger, except for a few on the right, understand this. You can take a look at the Gini coefficient. You can take a look at all this status from the IRS and all the rest. We have moved wealth from the bottom and the middle in this country to the top. That's why even our candidates talk about the middle class is dying, the middle class is going. Yeah, that's right. The middle has fallen out, number one. Number two, you subjected them after this kind of a thing to a pandemic, which really shook them up, an inflation, which shook them up, still shakes them up, and a serious diminution in your position in the world. You have, over the last 30 to 40 years, you lost the war in Vietnam, you lost the war in Afghanistan, you lost the war in Iraq, and you are losing the war in Ukraine. Too many things are happening. And the working class is hit in too many ways. It's upset, it's angry, it doesn't see a way out. That's a description of the German working class. That's why it went with Hitler. Enough, not all of it by a long shot, but enough of it to give him the chance to get rid of all of his enemies and reshape Germany. That ought to strike a chord. This morning's headline, 28th March 2025, the headline when I opened my news was that President Trump has appointed Vice President Vance to remove from the Smithsonian Institute the anti-American improper ideology. What the hell is that? What is that? You know what the first thing that comes to my mind? In the 1950s here in America, we had something called the Un-American Activities Committee in the House of Representatives that hounded people out of their jobs and their positions because they held views that a collection of congressmen, many from the South, held to be un-American. Now, we've come to regret that. That's McCarthyism, but that's what they did. By the way, among the people who left the United States because they were hounded by this committee for their ideas were Bertolt Brecht, Charlie Chaplin. I could go on. That's one of the reasons we came, I thought, to understand what an aberrant, horrible period this was. We understood nothing. We're just doing it again. Will the outcome be the same? I don't know. Maybe they'll win this time. Maybe we won't have what happened in the 50s. We'll have what happened in Germany in the 30s. But the story in Germany of a working class that was shocked The American working class was told that America was the king of the hill, which coming out of World War II, we were, and that this was just, it was the way it was, American exceptionalism, the uniqueness, God loves us, whatever the form in which you celebrated it. But nobody here was prepared that it would come to an end. That for the first time in a century, we actually have an economic competitor called China. We never had that. Russia, I think I told you this before, Russia was never, Soviet Union was not an economic competitor. It was way too poor, way too small. Even today, the American GDP is $29 trillion. Russian GDP, $3 trillion. This is David and Goliath, but David minus the slingshot. What? They have military, they have nuclear weapon. I shouldn't say minus the slingshot. Here's a slingshot, but it's still David with a slingshot. China's 18 or 19 trillion. That's a serious competitor. The two together, now you're talking, and they understand it, and so do the folks here. But not the American people. They must be kept innocent of all of this, except when they leak their materials to the Atlantic magazine.